The New Testament is considered the most historically reliable book of ancient history. Why? It has more documentary evidence than any other piece of ancient literature. In the book, Introduction to Research in English Literary History, the author lists the basic tests applied to verify the historical accuracy of all ancient documents. These three tests are the bibliographic test, the internal evidence test, and the external evidence test. The bibliographic test considers the number of existing manuscript copies of the original manuscript that exist. How closely to the original these copies were made. And generally, the more copies that exist and the closer to the original, the stronger is the evidence for the document's historical reliability. Perhaps an illustration will help clarify this bibliographic test. Assume your class writes a letter to the President of the United States. Surprisingly, a few weeks later, your class receives a letter of appreciation from the President. Now, for this illustration, let's assume there are no such things as copy machines or printer scanners. Now, each of your 20 classmates hand copies the letter and then donates the original to the local library. Sadly, the next week, terrorists break into the library and burn the letter in protest. How can we ever know what the President wrote? Well, easy, you say. We have 20 copies of the letter. However, as you compare the copies, you discover there are variant readings, variations from one copy to another. For example, Jill's copy reads, "Dear students, I was glad to receive your letter." However, Marty's copy reads, "Dear students, I was very glad to receive your letter." Now notice that this variation in the copies does not alter the meaning in any way of the letter. But how do we know which copy is accurate? Well, we have 18 other copies with which to compare these two variations. It turns out that the other 18 copies read just like Jill's. So we can safely say the original was written, "Dear students, I was glad to receive your letter." This illustration demonstrates that not having the original does not prevent us from reconstructing what was said from the copies. Obviously, the more copies of a document one has, the easier it is to reconstruct the original. So, how do the Bible copies compare with the other ancient literature? Caesar wrote his Gallic Wars about 50 BC. A total of 10 copies has survived to the present day. And these manuscripts were copied at least 1,000 years after his death. The writings of Tacitus, a Roman historian who wrote about 100 AD, are recognized as an outstanding historical source, even though the oldest copy of his work dates 1,000 years after he wrote. And we possess only 20 copies of his writings. Aristotle wrote his Poetics about 350 BC. The oldest copy dates a full 1,400 years later, and there are only 5 copies of any one of his works. In the case of the New Testament, the manuscript superiority is overwhelming. Over 20,000 copies or portions of the New Testament exist today. The closest second is the Iliad, with only 643 copies. Of these 20,000 copies, over 4,000 of these were written in Greek, the language of the original text. The Codex Vaticanus manuscript contains the whole New Testament and was written less than 300 years after the completion of the last book of the Bible in 95 AD. The earliest fragment of the Gospel of John is dated to 120 A.D. Leading textual scholar Sir Frederick Kenyon stated, "Scholars are satisfied that they possess substantially the true text of the principal Greek and Roman writers whose works have come down to us, of Sophocles, of Thucydides, of Cicero, or Virgil. Yet our knowledge of their writings depends on a mere handful of manuscripts, whereas the manuscripts of the New Testament are counted in hundreds and even thousands." Dr. John Warwick Montgomery has stated, "To be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no documents of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament. It is simply dishonest for anyone, including your teachers or professors, to claim the writings of Plato or Caesar are trustworthy and yet reject the reliability of the New Testament." Thanks once again to the research and writings of the Caleb Campaign in their book, The Bible in the Fiery Furnace.